Hey friends, good morning, or whenever you happen to be watching or listening to this message. We are continuing our series called Mountain Views, which I am a sucker for a good title, so well done, Pastor Kelly. We are talking about lessons from the Sermon on the Mount. And if you missed last week, hashtag blessed, it was so good on the Beatitudes. And this week I'll be kind of continuing on into chapter 6 of the book of Matthew, which is going further into Jesus' teaching from the mountain views. Love what we're doing right now. But I want to encourage you today as we start to subvert conventional wisdom. It's kind of what we're talking about today. I want you to subvert conventional wisdom. Now, before I talk about what it is that I actually want to talk about today, I'm going to do what I typically do. And that is I am going to share kind of some context and some historical settings that I think are going to help us understand what we're really kind of revealing today within the text. So, by the way, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Craig. Hi. My family and I live just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a part of the online community here at Icon Church, and I'm honored to be able to share this morning with Mountain Views. And today we are going to subvert conventional wisdom. I want to start in the town of Nazareth. Now, for those of you that kind of understand a little bit of the story of the New Testament and the story of Jesus, you understand that Jesus was raised in a little town of about 150 people called Nazareth, which is in Galilee. And if you kind of understand the layout of Israel at that time, you've got Judea, which is kind of where Jerusalem and Bethlehem, we're going to talk about Bethlehem here in a second. That's where that is. And then you've got Samaria, and then you've got Galilee. And Nazareth is up in the region of Galilee. Nazareth is kind of a reference. It's a play on words. It means shoot. And so it's kind of like the shoot out of Jesse's stump, which is referring to David and eventually Jesus, who we find from Matthew chapter 1, comes from the lineage of David and Jesse. And so you kind of get this idea Nazareth is like Shootville or Stumptown or something like that. I know that's kind of lame, but you kind of get the idea. So I want to actually start before we get to Matthew chapter 6 and unpack a couple of things that we see in Matthew chapter 2. Now, I'm not going to read it for you. I'm just going to reference it. You can go back on your own time and get there if you would like to, but there are a couple of things that we notice in Matthew chapter 2. This is the chapter that talks about the birth of Jesus. And we find out that Mary and Joseph come into this town called Bethlehem. And Luke tells us it's because of a census that was taking place where all Jewish people were called to their hometowns. Now, what's fascinating is when we think about what had previously happened, we think about the story of Joshua and the conquest of Canaan. And I'm not going to unpack how I really feel about all of that today. But when we think about the conquest of Canaan, we remember that each tribe was given an allotment of land. Within that allotment, every family was given a piece of land. And so you have this idea in Matthew chapter 2, as Jesus is being born, we find Matthew, the storyteller, telling us that Mary and Joseph, who we know are of the line of Jesse from Matthew and David from Matthew chapter 1, are leaving Nazareth and they're going to Bethlehem. And they're not just going to Bethlehem. We find out that they are staying in an inn. Why an inn? Because apparently so many people had been displaced and were now required to come back to their family town, their town that they are from, their family lands that they had lost, that there is nowhere else to go but to pay somebody else to stay where you should be living. So you get a picture of the first century of what life was like. They go to Bethlehem in Judea. Herod the Great rules Judea. We find out some things about Herod the Great, and he decides that he is jealous of this baby that is being born, that people are calling the rightful heir, the King of the Jews, that comes from the line of David, and you know, so we find out that he wants to kill every child underneath 2 years of age. And so Mary and Joseph flee with Jesus to Egypt. And then eventually we find out that Herod the Great has passed away, and Archelaus, who is his son, Herod Archelaus, is now over Judea. And that's what Matthew tells us. We find out, you know, through other sources that Herod Antipas is over Galilee, one of his other sons. And we'll kind of talk about some of the nuances within that. But, you know, we find out this idea, you know, why were Mary and Joseph raising Jesus in Nazareth? What is Matthew trying to tell us about the birth of Jesus? They are in occupied territory. Times are hard. The reality of the birth of Jesus has socioeconomic implications that Joseph had lost. Most likely it was either him or the generation before him had lost his family lands, and now in shame is going back to his hometown to be counted by a people that they don't even want there. They are in occupied territory. Israel goes from Egypt and the oppression and slavery in Egypt to the Babylonian exile, to now they are home, but they are in exile at home. They are under the Roman occupation, and Jesus is born in an inn in Bethlehem. Which means we have to talk about the hierarchy in agrarian society, right? I mean, we just have to kind of get there. You know, I grew up in a really small rural town in northern Illinois. My backyard was literally a cornfield. You know, it was 5,000 people were in my town. My graduating class from middle school, I think, was 43 kids. In my 8th grade class. And that was because we brought in like everybody from the surrounding rural communities that were outside of our town to like, you know, be there. And so I grew up in this really small rural farming community, agricultural community. My backyard was actually a cornfield, and we used to build potato guns and shoot them into cornfields. I used to get into a lot of trouble for that. Anyway, let's talk about the hierarchy of first century agrarian society. So we start in before you get anywhere else, you've got Caesar. Caesar was viewed as God incarnate, God in the flesh. In fact, Augustus Caesar actually claimed to be the son of God. And so you have this idea that you've got Caesar that basically owns everything. And then you have the rulers and the governing class. This is the upper class. It is less than 1% of the entire agrarian society, and it is at the top of the hierarchy. The overwhelming majority, 99% of the wealth, is owned by less than 1% of the population. Okay. Not that we can relate to any of this today, though in first century, there was no middle class at all. There was upper class, and then there was extreme poverty into the lower class. So after the rulers and governing authorities, we get to the retainer class. These would be, you know, lower level officials, professional soldiers, some household servants. Some of them would maybe be lower upper class. They were definitely not middle class. They were above middle class, but they did not have the wealth nor the power of the rulers and the governing class. And so there was a little bit of a disparity between those two, but nothing like the difference between the disparity between the retainer class and everybody else. After you get out of the retainer class, you have the merchant class. The merchant class might be most likely is comprised of people from the peasant class that owned or started to do well within business, but most of the merchant class was relatively poor. There might be a very, very small minority that had crossed over into the upper class because, again, there is no middle class. But the overwhelming majority of merchant class individuals were very poor individuals. After the merchant class, you get into the priestly class. The priestly class did not own property. They could have, depending on what community they were in, there could be a lot of people within the priestly class or very few people within the priestly class. And then you go to the peasant class. This is the overwhelming majority of people fell into the peasant class. 90% of the population was in poverty within the peasant class. Then below the peasant class, you have the artisan class. Now, this might be above the peasant class. It might be below the peasant class. It might just be a subset of the peasant class. But the artisan class were those that performed very specific roles. This might be in today's world where we kind of get the idea of a starving artist. Then you go from the artisan class to the unclean. Now, the unclean were those that were deemed ceremonially unclean. And when you live in a society where 99% of the people, or where less than 1% of the people owns 99% of the wealth, you have this idea that people kind of do anything just to make ends meet, even if it means they would be deemed ceremonially unclean. And typically, these were individuals that had jobs that either dealt with subjects or animals or something that, because of their proximity to that thing or that activity or that animal, whatever, it made them ceremonially unclean. Then you have a class below the unclean, which is known as the expendable class. They're primarily petty criminals, beggars, outlaws. These are people who can only survive either by their wits or the charity of others. There is virtually no middle class in first century agrarian society. It did not exist. 90% of the population was in poverty. It is believed that 2/3 of that 90% was living in extreme poverty. So we have Jesus being raised in Nazareth, the town of 150 people in Galilee, not his family's hometown, not where the king of the Jews should be raised, right? Nothing about this makes any sense. And 3 miles from Nazareth, there was the capital city of Galilee. It was a city called Sepphoris. And Sepphoris is the largest city in the region. 35,000 people are in and around the city of Sepphoris versus the 150 that are in Nazareth. Being 3 miles away from Nazareth, everybody knew what was happening in Sepphoris. Now, in the time of Herod the Great, which was, at the time of Jesus's birth, Herod used Sepphoris as kind of like a military outpost. He put tons of arms and munitions, and munitions in those days, put tons of arms in, we would call munitions, tons of arms there. It was a military outpost. After his death, there was just a lot of unrest, and there was actually an uprising, and a Jewish revolt took hold of the city of Sepphoris and held it for a good while. And so what Rome did is, under the leadership of General Varus, they came in and they obliterated the city of Sepphoris. I mean, just obliterated the city. They destroyed everything and killed everyone in it. Anyone that they did not kill, they sold into slavery. And so you get this idea that now, as Herod's son, Herod Antipas, is now over the region of Galilee, he is rebuilding the city of Sepphoris, making it the capital city of Galilee, this opulent city, all of these. I mean, he is making it a Roman, just the part of the glory of Rome and the Roman occupation. All of these pillars, this super ornate city with all of these building programs that would have brought in workers from all over the countryside, most likely, yes, even Nazareth. Artisans, craftsmen, carpenters probably would have gone the 3 miles from Nazareth to Sepphoris just to be able to pay the bills. Of course they would have. Herod Antipas was known for these massive building programs. He actually created these aqueducts that fed cisterns, and the city of Sepphoris was supplied with running water by a great water wheel. And in the city itself, there was a huge theater that was being constructed that would seat over 4,000 people in this theater. Now, in that time, they didn't call actors within the theater actors or actresses. They simply called them hypocrites. These hypocrites could transform themselves into becoming something or someone that they are not. They could fool everybody. See, deep down underneath, they were one way, but on the outside, they could pretend to be something completely different. They were masters at hiding their true selves. They could make you believe that this false persona was real. See, the theater for a good Jew in the first century, in agrarian society, the theater was off limits. You didn't go to the theater. That was where they had pagan festivals and feasts and celebrated Rome. In fact, some people believe that one of the first plays that Herod Antipas had was depicting Troy and essentially what happens to those that try to create an uprising. See, imagine walking in to the city of Sepphoris, this opulent city, and you see this massive theater that seats 4,000 people, and you hear the trumpets sound announcing the entrance of the actors, the hypocrites. Just a little side note. Jesus is the only person in the New Testament that references the theater. Which brings us to the passage we're actually talking about today. Matthew chapter 6. And I'm going to start in verse 1. We're going to go through verse 5, but I'm not going to go into one section which talks about prayer, and in particular, the Lord's Prayer, because I don't want to steal Pastor Sabrina's thunder. She's going to be speaking about that as we continue this series later, but I have to reference it because we are subverting conventional wisdom, right? And we have to talk about hypocrites, the actors. And then we're going to kind of continue on into verses 16 to 18 and pick back up into that theme of hypocrisy, the art of acting. So here's what Matthew is relaying from Jesus. Be careful not to practice your righteousness. Just a side note, often in this Sermon on the Mount, we can replace that word righteousness with justice, especially in the Beatitudes, which is so great, by the way. Just read the Beatitudes. By the way, Pastor Kelly's message, #blessed, was so good. You need to listen to it if you haven't. Anyway, just go read through the Beatitudes again. Where you see justice or righteousness, replace it with justice and see how that transforms the text in your mind. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, and we just found out there's a lot of people that are needy. When you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Do you notice what Jesus is doing? He's referencing the actors, the hypocrites, but where do actors reside? Of course, they reside in the theater, particularly probably the theater in Sepphoris. But Jesus says the hypocrites in the synagogues and on the streets. Whoa, what? I love what Jesus is doing right here. He continues on, truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be done in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. In other words, what you do when no one is looking, who you are when no one is looking, is who you are. Even if you don't think anyone knows, who you are when no one is looking is who you are. You can put on the face, you can walk into the synagogue or be out on the street, but deep down, you're actually just play acting. Jesus continues, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. Now we're going to skip the rest because, again, I don't want to steal Pastor Sabrina's thunder, but picking up in verse 16, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces and show others they are fasting. And the part of the practice was they would put ash on their face. Their hair would be all tangled and messy. Their beards would be all tangled and messy. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head, wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. You see the pattern. Your Father sees what is done in secret. What is done in secret will be rewarded. And we see this triad, giving, praying, fasting, all with relation to hypocrisy, to hypocrites, play actors, in synagogues and on the streets, not in their normal habitat. Jesus is subverting conventional wisdom. Does your inner life match what you show everyone else? Could you see why it would be so important for Jesus to talk about this in the first century, and yet how incredibly applicable it is for us today? Continuing on in verse 19. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and rust and vermin destroy. Sorry, it actually just says in the NIV, where moths and vermin destroy, but I love where it adds in rust. Anyway, where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And that is the crux of what Jesus is trying to communicate. Sometimes we can get confused in all of this heaven and earth talk, and I'm going to get to that in a second, but here's the kicker. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What Jesus is talking about is priorities, subverting conventional wisdom. Are your priorities what conventional wisdom says they should be? Or are you putting your treasures in other places, where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal? It is not referencing one day. What it's actually referencing is today, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I will get there, I promise. Now, Jesus continues. The eye is the lamp of the body, which is a really weird phrase. There's a reason it's a weird phrase. We'll talk about that in a second too. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. And Jesus makes it very, very clear what he is talking about this entire time. You cannot serve both God and money. Are we sure this was written in the first century? I mean, it really feels like this is a critique of capitalism, doesn't it? You cannot serve both God and and money. There's an idiom here that we need to understand. Oftentimes, the Gospels in particular, so in the New Testament, there's a lot of Hebrew references specifically within the Gospels. And that's because the Greek, the written Greek of the Gospels, not true of the rest of the New Testament, but of the Gospels, the written Greek actually came from Hebrew sources. And so there are some issues that we find in some of the Gospel translations, idioms that don't really, like phrases that make sense in the Hebrew, but don't really make sense in the Greek or in our English. And eyes, this idea of eyes is one of those things. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. Idioms have to do with a good eye or a bad eye, a healthy eye or an unhealthy eye. And in the Hebrew, this phrase for good eye is ayin tova. For bad eye, it is ayin ra'ah. And simply what it means is to have a good eye or a healthy eye is to be generous. To have a bad eye or an unhealthy eye is to be miserly or stingy. So here's what we get when we kind of overlay that picture. How you approach generosity is a lamp to the body. What you do in one area is how you are in every area, right? So what the eye does, it affects the entire body. If you are generous, your whole body will be full of light. If you are miserly, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the generosity within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Remember, Jesus has been alluding to this idea of hypocrisy, hypocrites, actors, play actors, people that are pretending to be one way when in reality, they are something else. This is that same reference. If you are pretending to be generous, but in reality, you are miserly, how great is your miserliness? It's a weird phrase that just came out. If you're pretending to be something that you're not, how much greater is that lie, that darkness? No one can serve two masters. You will either hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Subvert conventional wisdom. Generosity over stinginess, being miserly. Generosity wins the day, but you can't fake it. You've got to actually be generous, because what we do in one area of our lives affects every other area. The eye affects the whole body. Who you are when no one is looking is who you are. Who I am in one area is who I am. So quick note, I said I would get back to this. When Jesus taught us to pray, and I'm sorry, Pastor Sabrina, I gotta mention it, on earth as it is in heaven, we have this picture of trying to bring heaven to earth. So when Jesus is referencing this contrast between earth and heaven, it's not a reference to just being rewarded one day. It is a reference to priorities. Are we living as if heaven is come right here and right now? What are our priorities? Do we have earthly, temporal priorities, or do we have heavenly priorities? Are our priorities going to last, right? Are the things that we're doing right now, does it actually matter? And then Jesus is looking through the motives and going, if you are generous, you are living in that heaven way. You are bringing heaven to earth. You are living within the way of Jesus, subverting conventional wisdom. But if you are miserly, even though he is speaking to primarily people in poverty, because it's not, being generous isn't just about whether or not you have money. I know a lot of people that have a lot of money that are not generous. Socioeconomics is all throughout the gospel. It is all throughout the Sermon on the Mount. Generosity apparently is very important to Jesus on earth as it is in heaven. Heaven is not just not referencing some distant future hope, but a present reality right here and right now. We are subverting conventional wisdom through our priorities. Treasure is not about the way of capitalism or imperialism or how those things define it, but it is defined through the subversive kingdom of God. We cannot serve two masters. Heaven is about where the presence of God resides. Right here, right now. So when we are bringing heaven to earth, we are saying, and apparently Jesus believes, that God is here. So may you, my friends, as I close, do what Jesus says at the close of chapter 6. May you not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body or what you will wear. May you remember that life is more than food and the body more than clothes. As you look at the birds of the air, who do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet our Heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Therefore, my friends, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. May you seek first his kingdom and his justice, and all of these other things be given to you as well. May you be more and more like Christ and subvert conventional wisdom. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Craig, for that message. And I learned something new today. I did not know when Jesus was talking about the eye being the lamp of the body, I never knew the connection between that and generosity. And I just, lately have been thinking so much about the whole concept of generosity, not just generosity, but even Jesus's teachings on wealth and possessions and money, which are, if you really dive into it, are really intense. And so that's been something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. So that was really helpful to make that connection of just even, knowing kind of the conditions of society and culture then, how there were so many people who were going without, and yet there was this elite group of the wealthy who were basically hoarding the resources and the wealth. And this definitely shines a light as to why Jesus would make such a big deal about money and possessions, and why his teachings on money and possessions were so intense, why he would say things like, you cannot serve both God and money, because they were living in a time where money was an idol, and like Craig said, not too different from where we find ourselves today. So I'm definitely going to be thinking about that this week, about just that idea of, when you're generous, that really is a part of bringing the kingdom of God here, is living these radically generous lives in every way. And so, yeah, I'm going to be thinking about that this week, and I hope all of you will be thinking about that too. So again, Craig, thank you so much for sharing that with us today. Thank you all so much for being here today. Just have a couple of announcements to remind you of before we say goodbye for this week. We have our next in-person gathering coming up next week at Buck's Backyard. So excited about that. This will be our fourth monthly in-person gathering, and it's just been like the highlight of my month each month to be able to get together with all of you and to see your faces. And so I really hope that a lot of you will be able to make it out so we can be together. And then also really exciting, so during that in-person gathering, we are going to be doing child dedications. So for those of you who don't know what that is just a practice that we do where parents and caregivers can bring their children, and we just as a church family commit to supporting and to being there for that family as they do their best to raise their children up to love God. And so, yeah, we're going to do that next week. So if you're interested in having your child, and it doesn't have to be an infant, it can be if you have older children that you'd like to participate in this practice, you can feel free to go to our website, and there's a place there where you can, I think Amanda put the link. See, Amanda is so on it. She is so on it. She put the link there in the chat. So if you'd like to register to dedicate your child, go ahead and do so. We do need to know ahead of time, just because we have some special things that we have prepared that we need to be able to get ready for your family and for your kiddos. So that is all that I have for today. I love you all so much, and I am looking forward to hanging out with all of you next week and seeing you all in person. And I hope that you all have a fantastic week. We'll see you next Sunday.